So welcome to this edition of our WebeXions webinar. Delighted to have Andrew Watkin with us from Ascent Corporate Finance Limited. Andrew is a very experienced accountant as well as corporate finance advisor and has spent many years in the industry supporting businesses to raise funds, to exit, and to just general corporate finance process. Has been a partner of a major firm within Hertfordshire for some 30 years. But on leaving practice, as it were, decided to support businesses with their succession strategies. And we're going to talk today about employee ownership trust as part of that process. So without further ado, if I could pass over to Andrew, that would be great. Thank you.
Ian, thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My presentation this morning is very much an overview of employee ownership trusts. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but please take the opportunity to ask questions at the end of my presentation. The idea of the talk is to make you aware of employee ownership companies and to give you an appreciation of what is involved. So what is an employee ownership trust? Well, very simply, it's a discretionary trust set up by a company's owner or owners to enable its employees, both current and future, to become beneficiaries of it and indirectly hold a stake in the company. The trustee is usually a company limited by guarantee, and these trusts have existed at least since the 1970s. But new tax reliefs were introduced in 2014 to encourage business owners to go down this route. Indeed, recent trends have been identified by recent statistics released by the Employee Ownership Association and the White Rose Centre for Employee Ownership. Indeed, between 2020 and 2022, over 1,000 businesses adopted employee ownership. In last year alone, 332 new businesses transitioned to this status. And as of June this year, the total number of employee-owned businesses reached 1,418. That's a 37% growth in the last 12 months. So we can see there's been a significant take-up to empower employees, drive the business forward, and provide a means of succession. Indeed, it's not just concentrated on one area. For example, professional service businesses account for 39% of the employee ownership trusts. Manufacturing businesses, 15%, construction, 14%, wholesale and retail, 11%, and information and communication, 8%. So it is spread across a number of different sectors. So let's just look very simply at what's involved. The concept is this. Let's start at the top left-hand side. The sellers decide that they want to create an employee ownership trust. The trust is set up and they sell their shares to the trust, at which point the trust will pay for those shares and probably have to issue debt. In order for it to pay for the shares in the first place and the debt going forward, the company needs to pay money into the trust itself. In addition to that, the company will give a guarantee to the sellers that the debt will be repaid. So, for example, let's just say the sellers agree that they will sell their shares for £1 million. But the reserves and indeed the surplus cash in the company only allow it to pay £350,000 on completion. This leaves £650,000 worth of debt, which the company will pay over, let's say, a period of 5 to 8 years. So you can see initially there are some risks there, and we'll come on to how these can be mitigated later on. So what are the benefits to the seller? Well, there's no need to go to the market as there's a readily available buyer, that's the trust, willing to pay a fair price for the shares. That's going to eliminate the need for a search for external buyers or a sale even to competitors. The employees are allowed to fund the purchase through the profits and surplus cash of the company. On the softer side, the preservation of culture, the values and the legacy that they help to build with the owners will mitigate the risks associated with third-party sales. And this is now the carrot, because unlike traditional sales routes, selling to an employee ownership trust does not attract capital gains tax on the consideration received for the shares. So this offers huge potential tax advantages. There's no cap on the amount that you can put into an employee ownership trust in terms of the valuation, unlike business asset disposal relief, where the lifetime limit is £1 million. Not all the shareholders need sell, but at the end of the day, the trust must end up with at least 51% of the shares. So, for example, if you have 4 shareholders, the 4 shareholders could agree to sell part of their holdings such that the trust ends up with this 51% when completion takes place. And that 51% must have voting rights, dividend rights, and winding up rights. There are further benefits to the sellers, since it will help with succession, as the directors can remain in place afterwards, already having sold part or all of their shares into the trust. It's a friendly purchase, in other words, but as I'm sure you'll appreciate, there are lots of conditions attached to all of this, which I don't have time to go into this morning. But let's look at other benefits. Let's look at the benefits for employees. The employees should be able to have far more job security with an employee ownership trust, which they might lose out on during the integration where there has been a third-party sale. They do participate because they do have a voice in the running of the business, as they are represented by a trustee on the trust itself. The trust must at all times represent them. It must always act in the best interest of the employees. And this is a change, if you like, in the attitude of the owners, because they no longer have the final say on the big decisions. And I think any owners looking to do this must be prepared to make this change in their attitudes towards their company. But it does give the talent in the business the opportunity to take the business forward into the future. There won't be any new leadership coming in terms of if there was a third-party sale or a management buy-in, and they will continue to be empowered to drive the business forward. Indeed, they will get a financial reward, because once the debt has been repaid by the trust to the owners, then the employees will have significant rights over the profits of the company. Again, there are conditions for all of this, which I don't have time to go into. But let's look at the benefits to the business itself. I think the main benefit is that the continuity. The business will continue in the long term as it was, even though succession has taken place, be that a complete going away from the business by the owner or staying on for a period of time. As I've indicated, there's far greater chances of staff retention with an employee ownership trust. And as we all know with third-party sales, the service to customers can actually deteriorate afterwards, whereas with an EOT, the customers will receive the same service after completion, and that will ensure the benefits for the company going forward. Employees will retain their jobs, and from the business owner's point of view, the character of the business is protected. So if that's something that they are proud of, the owners that is, then an EOT is actually quite a good mechanism to ensure that their legacy continues. The EOA has demonstrated that businesses under these ownership structures can be more productive and innovative, and they have evidence to support this. But the resilience of the business going forward is provided by the trust, which I said is a layer above the board. So why should an owner or owners sell their shares to an EOT? Well, let's just forget the tax release for now. What alternative succession plans are there for the owners? Well, you can have a trade sale, you can have management buyout, a management buy-in, a family buyout, or whatever. But these type of arrangements tend to be commercially structured transactions. Trade sales, and in my experience, management buyouts can actually be quite confrontational. Price reductions can happen, due diligence is undertaken, and there's integration plans that need to be put in place that can be very disruptive. Not only that, but we're now seeing increasing amounts of earnouts included in the deal structures, whereby not only is the consideration not guaranteed, but it's also subject to certain performance criteria. Overriding all of this can be personality problems with regard to the integration itself. So while all this is going on, the management can remain focused while the deal is going on, as opposed to these more commercially structured transactions where they do get involved. So I think as an owner, you need to buy into the concept of an employee ownership as a succession plan, not necessarily an exit plan, but a means of moving the business forward, whereby you as the owners can at least have some capital sum at this point in time. I do think, though, from my experience, that an EOT really needs to be applied to a mature business that still has some growth and opportunities going forward. And I'm afraid I do see it happening too late, in that the owners have left it too late, and the managers are not in a position or don't have the skills in order to repay the loan if a complete exit is planned. So why sell your shares to an EOT? I think you have to ask yourself, are you going to receive more money in a shorter period of time, i.e. through a trade sale, but against that have less aggravation than these alternative routes? So it really is the question of objectivity versus subjectivity. Let's just look at some practical issues. What price does the owner receive for their shares? Well, they probably want as much as they can get, but there has to be some form of independent valuation carried out, because the owner is in a conflict of interest, and that's why you have the independent trustee. And indeed, Baxendale, for example, will not allow an EOT to go ahead without an independent and usually professional trustee. The danger is that if the trustees overpay for their shares, then that is a breach of that trust, because they've not carried out the transaction in the best interest of the employees. And indeed, the owners will, any excess, will be liable to income tax and national insurance charge going forward. Transactions costs. These under an EOT tend to be lighter than a sale to a third party. The documentation is a lot easier as it's an internal sale. There are less negotiations carried on, and the due diligence is less detailed. But I would say here that whilst most companies don't have skeletons, there is situations where there might be skeletons in the cupboard. Now, that might be legal issues. It might be that the accounts are in a mess. It might be that there are slow payers or even bad debts. And I think it's only fair to the employees, and to gain their trust, that they don't inherit a business that's got the skeletons in the cupboard. So if these are the case, then I think the owner has to face up, get them sorted, and then look at moving on to an EOT. In a trade sale, they're going to come up anyway in due diligence. So get them sorted as soon as possible. The trustees on that point are going to want some protection. And therefore, in the sales documentation, there are going to be standard warranties and indeed, if necessary, indemnities against anything that might prejudice the business going forward. People ask me, can we then sell our company once we've moved it into an EOT ownership? This is not a good idea, because the trust will inherit the shares at the basic cost to the individual. Therefore, if the sales goes through at a market rate, they will pay capital gains tax on that full amount. If there's still loans outstanding, they are going to have to repay that out of the share of the proceeds that they've received. And if there's anything left after all of that, the employees will then receive some money, but that will be subject to income tax and national insurance on the distribution itself. So a subsequent sale is not necessarily a good idea. Are there any benefits, though, to the employees? The key benefit that's highlighted to the employees is this bonus of up to $3,600 each year per employee. It's free of income tax, but not national insurance. And it's paid for by the company, not by the trust. Now, the amount needs to be set by reference to percentage of salary, length of service, hours worked. It has to be objective. Now, if there are bonus plans in place already, they can continue, because this benefit is out with those arrangements. But you cannot allow one group of employees, such as directors or higher paid, to benefit to a greater extent under this arrangement than other employees will. So each person gets this amount of money subject to the three conditions that I've outlined here. It can't be paid as part of regular wages or as a salary sacrifice, and all employees are entitled to it who've had at least 6 months service with the business. One of the other benefits that can arise for employees is something called enterprise management incentives, or EMI options. Now, what are they? Very simply, they give employees the right to subscribe for shares at a point in time at a value agreed now, such that in, let's say, 5 years' time, they can sell their shares at a higher value, having paid a lower value out of those proceeds, such that any gain they make will be taxed at 10%, providing, of course, they own more than 5% of the shares. Now, at this point in time, the value is determined and agreed with the revenue at the time of the grant, and then options are granted to employees to take up shares in the future at that agreed price. So they would exercise their options in, say, 8 years' time, paying for the shares at today's value and receiving from the trust the future value. It would normally be that they can only be exercised once the debt has been repaid. So why go through all of this? Well, let me show you. Senior management might not like the idea of an EOT, but an EMI might soften the blow. Let's say up to 25% of the equity is going to be realized in, say, 8 years' time, once the debt has been paid off. Now, this can be a sweetener, as I've said, if a management buyout may have been an alternative, but the managers are unable to come up with the cash to make the initial payments under the MBO. The question is, will there be enough incentive for the senior management to grow the business, repay the debt, and then be able to exercise their EMI options? So let's take an example. Let's say the consideration for all the shares on the sale to a trust on the on the initiation of the EOT is £5 million. In 8 years' time, the management has done really well. The company has doubled in value, so it's now worth 10 million. The managers have repaid all the debt, and they decide to exercise their EMI options. So what they will do is they will have 25%, which is 2.5 million. Their gain is 1.25 million because it's grown by 100%. The tax on that is 10%. So the net proceeds to management is just over £1 million. Now, the question is from an owner's point of view, is that going to be something which is going to encourage the managers to go down the EOT route? So what are the incentives? From the vendor, it's free CGT. From the employees, they get ownership of the company. But for the senior management, the question is, are they going to lose out? And can the EMI option arrangement mitigate those potential disadvantages? Let's just go back to the steps. Very simply, there are 3 steps. If the company qualifies for an EOT, then it's established with a corporate trustee. There is an independent valuation on behalf of the trustees, the company, and the shareholders. Once this is agreed, this forms the basis of the purchase price, and the shareholder or shareholders will sell to the trustee company, whereby the consideration is paid with surplus cash and, if required, debt. The company carries on paying distributions to the trustees, who pay off the debt to the owners over a period of time. It might be 5 to 8 years, just depending upon the cash flow and profits of the company. What are the key roles in all of this? Well, the company continues just like any other. The operations are carried out by the board as in the past. They are responsible for running the company. The employees do not run the company. Now, if the business is performing well, its financials are working out okay, its culture, its values are being retained, then the trustees are going to say this is successful. They still might meet 2 to 4 times a year, but their role, where this is the case, is going to be to support and challenge the board. They are like a governor of a school, a critical friend. They act in that role, and they provide this extra level of protection for the employee interests. There are some misconceptions. I do think that employees are unlikely to work where a buyer cannot be found. Now, I've chosen my words carefully here, because if an offer has been made, but the owners have rejected it, they have a better reason for coming to the employees and saying, why don't we do an EOT, than if a buyer can't be found, i.e. there's not even an offer, and then they go to the employees as a plan B when plan A has failed altogether. The company can still be agile and make decisions, and indeed part of some of the members of the EOA are cutting-edge companies which have gone this way, and the boards are still making the day-to-day decisions regarding research and development, product development, product commercialization, and so forth. The employees can be incentivized as the profits are shared on a commercial basis, and this can attract the best people who don't want to be involved in a third-party sale or whatever. And the owners can leave the business while it continues. But of course, they've got to be satisfied that the management can repay that debt. So what is Ascent's role in all of this? Well, I work alongside professionals such as Baxendale's, and I have a lot of involvement at the start. We need to look at the viability. Is this project feasible? Or is there something better out there, i.e. a third-party trade sale? And I work with the client, the shareholders, and the trustees on financial modelling to ensure the scheme is feasible. If it is feasible, then we need to apply to the revenue for clearances. And then very much I will duck out and leave it up to the experts such as Baxendale's to take it forward. Now, they have two essential roles. One is legal and one is communications. On the legal side, they will create a structure with sellers to make sure they're comfortable with the debt, ensuring that protections are in place so the owners are comfortable around the risk they are taking. They will form the trust deed, which contains the governance and the trust composition. They may take a place on the board. That's not necessarily required. And they'll certainly need to change the articles or the trust deed to represent the interests of the employees. So again, I come back from the owner's point of view, the shift is that the business is run for the benefit of the employees. Now, I'm not saying that you don't do that, but that will become the primary objective of this or of these arrangements. Now, on the soft side and the communications, this is where experts such as Baxendale's do score, because they make sure everyone understands the proposition and what it looks like in practice. They will undertake trainings. They'll have meetings for the trustees and the directors, so everyone understands their roles and responsibilities. They take them through the legal documentation, so everyone's comfortable with what they're signing. It's likely they're going to have to attend the completion meeting, and they certainly will be around afterwards for a few months or even a few years in order to help the company through this transition period. So what are the timescales? Well, a lot of thought needs to go in, and I think that a feasibility study needs to be carried out, and this can take, let's say, 3 months. After that, you're looking at a minimum of 3 to 6 months to get everything in place, because I think, as you can appreciate from what I've said, it's not a straightforward arrangement, but it is a lot simpler than, say, a third-party sale or a management buyout. If the sellers are making the decisions, then obviously this can be quicker because there's less parties involved. You don't have third parties or bankers involved. And if collaboration is required, and then workshops and so forth can take longer with Baxendale's help. I've mentioned this feasibility report, and I've had clients who have looked at MBOs and EOTs, and they failed initially for 2 reasons. A, the confidence of the management not to repay the debt, and B, too much debt already in the company such that it cannot then have further debt placed on it, as from a bank point of view, there are insufficient profits to cover the repayments of interest and capital on the various loans. So the feasibility report needs to look at the number of shares to be sold and what their value might be. What is the consideration required by the sellers? So there might need to be some compromise reached there. It's no good if the company doesn't have the reserves to make the initial consideration, because when the money goes across, that's effectively a distribution, like a dividend, and there needs to be sufficient profits in the company in order to do this. I've mentioned about looking at the viability. Can the company repay this money, let's say over 5 or 8 years' time, without prejudicing its cash flow too much? What existing borrowings, including lease commitments, management's ability to repay, and whether or not EMI options are going to work for the key managers if they are required. But it's no good the vendor saying, oh, I'm going to have this gain tax-free, if at the end of the day, they don't receive all their money, because they would have paid tax at 10%. So they need to really receive all their money to make it reasonable. So in a nutshell, what are the advantages? First of all, the owners will receive fair value for the shares and they're tax-free. It is a low-stress transaction compared to other routes, and there is possible legacy for the employees and job retention. And the owners can still retain day-to-day control if they want, or they can transition the business over a period of time to a new management team. The disadvantage is that the vendors could be paid over a much longer period of time compared to more accelerated payment profile for a third-party sale. or where the acquisition is financed by a bank. Trade sale is likely to provide a higher purchase price, particularly if you can have more than two buyers interested in the business, but it will be subject to deferred consideration. And we're finding now there are more and more of the transactions are structured to include an earnout. But key management may lose out on a potential of an investment that can be realized later as a much larger gain as part of an MBO arrangement. In my example, they were going to get 25% of the proceeds. Under an MBO, the chances are they receive a much higher percentage of the proceeds going forward. This has been very much a high-level helicopter view of EOTs, and there are lots and lots of conditions which I've only just touched on, but I would advise you not to go ahead with this without taking advice and considering it really deeply. And at the very least, I think you must carry out a feasibility study. You need to get all your ducks in a row, because it's no good going to the employees and saying to the key guys, do you think an EOT is a good idea? Merely to come back 2 or 3 months later to say, well, I've had to think about it and I don't think it's a good idea. I think you lose a lot of face, and I think you need to be able to be sure that's the route you want to go down when you approach the employees. Now, on my website, I've got some various other documents. What are EOTs? The legal bits and the tax incentives are dealt with in more detail. But I've also made a comparison between a trade sale and an EOT, so it gives you a better idea of the context of an EOT in relation to a trade sale. Thank you very much for listening, and if there are any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Ian, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. That's a very comprehensive presentation. And we did have some questions come through, but you've covered some of them. One question that is there is that, you know, this should be probably planned ahead. I think you made that point within your presentation. And when businesses and owners are looking at the way forward, you know, is it right that they should be talking to someone like yourself or other advisors maybe, but sort of 3 to 5 years ahead or 3 years ahead, so they can actually look at where they're going? It's normal business practice to say you should be at least planning for 3 years, but there you go.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I think if I'm talking to an owner who is looking for some form of succession plan, I'm obviously going to go through the various options, i.e. a trade sale, a management buyout, a management buy-in, or the family. Increasingly now, I'm afraid to say that one of the options is winding up the business. But I'll also make them aware of whether ask them about the capabilities of management, because there's 2 routes with management, either the MBO or the EOT, but they have to have confidence that the managers can actually take the business forward. And if the managers can't raise the money for an MBO, then an EOT might be an alternative. But it's something that it doesn't apply to every business. So, for example, I had a business where the employees were inside a partnership and the trade was run by a company. Now, you can't have an EOT through a partnership. So all of that had to be restructured in order to put forward an EOT as a viable option going forward. So I think you're right. You've got to look at these early on in the succession planning discussions, and maybe just put them on the back burner and look at other options in more detail, but always bear in mind that they are a possibility. But don't leave it to the last minute, because as we know, things can change quite rapidly nowadays, and therefore to be able to have that in place at a good point in time is a good idea.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think that's quite a key point, and we always like to see a bit of planning in place. What Andrew has actually done for us as well is done a Q&A, additional questions and answers, which we will post on the website. So it leaves me to thank you, Andrew, for your time this morning. great presentation. We will be posting the recording and video onto the Biz for Biz website, where you can follow that as well. So, and I know Andrew will also be using it to circulate for further information. So once again, thank you for attending this morning, and thank you, Andrew. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.